Have you ever looked at a modern semi-truck thundering down the highway with its aerodynamic sleeper cab, complete with a microwave, a flat-screen television, a memory foam mattress, and digital climate control, and wondered how the very first truckers survived before any of this luxurious infrastructure existed? Imagine it is the bitter, unforgiving winter of 1924. You are entirely alone on a pitch-black, unpaved mountain pass in a rigid, rattling machine that feels significantly more like an industrial torture device than a transportation vehicle. The icy wind is howling relentlessly through the unsealed, drafty floorboards. The temperature is rapidly dropping well below freezing, and your nearest chance of help is 50 miles away over a treacherous path of frozen mud ruts. You absolutely cannot leave your highly valuable cargo, and you physically cannot keep driving because your exhausted eyes are literally frosting shut from the exposure. So, in a frozen, desolate wasteland with no motels, no truck stops, and no emergency services, where exactly do you sleep? The answer is both terrifying and brilliant. You climb out into the freezing pitch-black darkness, walk to the exposed rear of the cab, and crawl into a homemade uninsulated wooden box barely larger than a human coffin, suspended dangerously close to a roaring, violently vibrating chassis. Why would any rational human being willingly lock themselves in a tiny freezing wooden cage miles away from civilization just to deliver freight? The truth is a completely forgotten chapter of brutal survival, desperate engineering, and sheer, unfiltered human willpower that will permanently change how you look at every single truck you pass on the road today. By the end of this journey, you will stop seeing modern sleeper cabs as a luxury and start understanding them as the evolutionary result of a deadly, high-stakes game of survival. To truly understand the absolute madness of the 1920s sleeper box, we have to entirely erase the modern world from our minds. There was no interstate highway system. There were no brightly lit truck stops with hot showers and endless coffee. The road network of the 1920s was largely a disorganized, horrifying collection of dirt paths, ancient wagon trails, and gravel tracks that turned into bottomless, unnavigable swamps the moment a rainstorm hit. The trucks themselves were primitive, monstrous beasts of iron and wood, lacking almost everything we consider essential for basic human safety today. We are talking about machines like the early Mack AC Bulldogs or heavily modified Ford Model Ts. These early mechanical titans had solid rubber tires, not air-filled pneumatics that cushioned the ride, but solid, unyielding blocks of hard rubber that transmitted every single jarring rock, pothole, and frozen rut directly up through the rigid iron suspension, into the wooden bench seat, and straight into the driver's spine. Driving one of these early rigs was not just a job, it was a grueling test of extreme physical endurance that routinely left men bruised, bleeding, and permanently damaged. There was no power steering. Turning the massive wooden steering wheel required immense upper body strength, and if one of the solid front tires violently struck a deep rut at the wrong angle, the steering wheel could spin backward with such explosive force that it would instantly snap a driver's wrists or break their thumbs. Now, add the completely open or poorly enclosed cabs to this chaotic equation. In the summer, you choked on blinding clouds of pulverized dust and roasted behind a front-mounted engine that acted like an unshielded furnace. In the winter, you were subjected to sub-zero blizzards with absolutely no heating system whatsoever. The only thing standing between a 1920s driver and instant frostbite was however many layers of heavy wool, leather, and sheepskin they could physically wear while still being able to operate the heavy, non-synchronized transmission levers. So, after 14 agonizing hours of wrestling a solid tire monster across a frozen, shattered landscape, when your body simply cannot take another mile and your brain starts hallucinating from extreme fatigue, what happens? But let me ask you a crucial question that exposes the real mystery of this era. If the physical toll was so unbelievably horrific and the cold was genuinely deadly, why didn't these pioneering drivers just pull their trucks into the nearest town, park in front of a warm boarding house, and sleep in a real bed by a warm fire like any normal traveler would? It seems like the most obvious, logical solution in the world, doesn't it? The reason they didn't, and the reason they couldn't, comes down to a lethal combination of raw economics and absolute liability. In the Roaring '20s, trucking was a highly unregulated, cutthroat frontier industry. when a merchant or a factory owner loaded a shipment of expensive textiles, critical machine parts, or highly lucrative, entirely illegal bootleg liquor onto the back of a truck, that driver became instantly and personally responsible for every single ounce of it. There were no advanced insurance policies covering cargo theft for independent operators in the middle of nowhere. If a driver parked an unsecured canvas-covered load of valuable goods in a dark alley behind a rural inn, went inside to sleep for 6 hours, and woke up to find the cargo stolen by highwaymen or desperate locals, his life as he knew it was effectively over. He would be ruined financially. His reputation would be permanently destroyed, and in the case of moving illicit goods during the height of Prohibition, a missing load could easily result in a violent, fatal retaliation from organized crime syndicates. The cargo was the driver's life, and therefore, the driver absolutely could not abandon the truck. He was tethered to his machine by an invisible chain of crushing responsibility. But sleeping draped over a massive wooden steering wheel in an open cab at 20 degrees below zero is a guaranteed death sentence. The human body physically cannot generate enough thermal energy to survive a static night in those conditions. So, out of desperate, freezing necessity, the first sleeper cabs were born, not in sophisticated engineering laboratories in Detroit, but in cold, dimly lit farm barns and dirty back-alley mechanic shops by the drivers themselves. These early sleeper berths were notoriously dubbed coffin boxes, and once you understand their dimensions and construction, you realize that nickname was not a joke. It was a chillingly accurate, literal description. Because early trucks were entirely designed to maximize profitable cargo space at the expense of human comfort, there was virtually zero room left for a driver to rest. To solve this, drivers began scavenging scrap wood, heavy plywood, and cheap pine boards to build tiny rectangular enclosures directly behind the driver's seat, or sometimes slung precariously beneath the actual cargo bed itself. Imagine crawling into a wooden box that is roughly 6 feet long, perhaps barely 2.5 feet wide, and completely devoid of any headroom. You could not sit up in it. You could barely roll over without slamming your shoulders against the rough, splintering wooden walls. There was no sophisticated ventilation system, no plush mattress, and certainly no climate control. A luxury setup might feature a thin, lumpy cotton mattress or a stolen horse blanket laid over a pile of dry straw to cushion the agonizing vibrations of the truck frame. These coffin boxes were entirely uninsulated, meaning that whatever the ambient temperature was outside, the inside of the box was only fractionally warmer, heated strictly by the trapped body heat of the exhausted driver. The claustrophobia alone would be enough to induce a massive panic attack in a modern human. But for the 1920s trucker, this tiny dark wooden cage was their only sanctuary against the freezing wind and the dangerous elements. They would painstakingly back their trucks against a solid brick wall or a heavy cluster of dense trees to protect the vulnerable rear doors of their cargo hold, shut down the massive rattling engine, and then quietly slide into the pitch-black darkness of the wooden box, pulling a heavy canvas flap or a latching wooden door shut behind them to seal out the world. Are you thinking what I'm thinking right now? Let me pause and ask you something that completely changes the perspective of this terrifying situation. If you are locked inside a completely dark, uninsulated wooden box, roughly the size of a burial coffin, with outside temperatures plunging so low that water freezes instantly, how do you keep your blood flowing? How do you prevent yourself from quietly slipping into severe hypothermia and simply never waking up the next morning? Because a wooden box doesn't generate heat, it merely blocks the wind. This is where the sheer, desperate ingenuity of these early pioneers borders on absolute brilliance. Since they couldn't run the truck's engine all night, fuel was far too expensive, engines were notoriously unreliable and could easily seize, and the deafening noise would make sleep literally impossible. They had to invent their own primitive, highly dangerous thermal strategies. One of the most common methods was the heated brick technique. While the truck's engine was running and roaring at full operating temperature during the day's agonizing drive, the driver would strategically place a large, solid masonry brick directly on top of the cast-iron exhaust manifold or right against the boiling engine block. Over several hours, this dense brick would absorb an immense amount of thermal energy, becoming searingly hot. When it was finally time to pull over and crawl into the coffin box, the driver would use thick, grease-stained leather gloves or heavy metal tongs to carefully extract the scorching brick from the engine bay. They would rapidly wrap the hot brick in several layers of thick wool or old, heavy burlap sacks to prevent it from instantly burning their skin or catching the straw mattress on fire. And then they would drag this makeshift radiant heater into the wooden box with them. They would place it carefully at the foot of their tiny sleeping quarters. That single, glowing hot brick would act as a localized thermal battery, slowly radiating just enough desperately needed heat over the next 4 to 5 hours to keep the ambient air inside the cramped box barely above freezing, preventing the driver's toes from suffering severe frostbite. It was a razor-thin margin of survival, balancing precariously between freezing to death in the cold or accidentally igniting your own wooden sleeping box and burning alive in the middle of nowhere, but the brutal cold was only half of the psychological nightmare. Let's really put ourselves inside that wooden box for a moment. What happens when the sun fully disappears? The hot brick begins to rapidly lose its heat, and the utter, absolute darkness of a 1920s rural night sets in. You have to remember, there was almost zero light pollution back then. When you were parked on a dirt road in a heavily forested valley in the dead of night, the darkness was absolute and suffocating. You are lying in a tiny wooden box. You cannot see your own hand directly in front of your face, and because you're encased in wood, your hearing becomes hypersensitive. Every single sound from the terrifying wilderness outside is magnified. You hear the deep, unsettling crack of freezing tree branches. You hear the howling of wild timber wolves or stray coyote packs, drawn by the lingering scent of your truck's cargo or the faint smell of whatever meager rations you ate for dinner. But much worse than the wild animals were the human predators. Highwaymen, cargo thieves, and desperate, poverty-stricken wanderers constantly roamed these rural routes, knowing full well that stalled or parked trucks were treasure troves of valuable goods. The driver lying in the coffin box kept a heavy tire iron, a solid wooden club, or a loaded revolver tucked right beneath their makeshift pillow at all times. They slept with one ear constantly listening for the distinct, terrifying crunch of boots on the gravel outside, or the sickening sound of a crowbar forcefully prying at the cargo doors. Imagine the immense psychological toll of trying to force your exhausted brain to sleep while simultaneously maintaining a state of high adrenaline hypervigilance, knowing that if someone decides to attack the truck, you are literally trapped in a blind, wooden box and have only seconds to aggressively kick your way out and defend your life and your livelihood. It was a recipe for intense paranoia. Yet these men subjected themselves to it night after night, week after week, to keep the fragile, growing supply chains of a booming nation moving forward. Let's twist the scenario and dive even deeper into this forgotten world. What if the truck didn't politely stop at the end of the day? What happens when the machine violently fails you exactly when you need it the most? Let me ask you, how would you handle a sudden, catastrophic mechanical failure when you are entirely alone? It's 3 in the morning. The temperature is plummeting, and there are absolutely no tow trucks, no emergency radios, and no passing traffic to save you, because this wasn't a rare occurrence. It was a guaranteed weekly reality. Early internal combustion engines and crude drivetrains were incredibly prone to catastrophic failure. An axle would violently snap on a hidden rock. A primitive drive chain would completely shatter and fly apart into the freezing mud. Or a radiator would catastrophically boil over and crack the engine block on a steep, unforgiving incline. Suddenly, the driver isn't making a calculated, strategic choice to park for the night. They are violently stranded. When this happened, the wooden sleeper box transitioned from a harsh resting place into a desperate, final life raft. If a blizzard was rolling in, the driver knew with absolute certainty that no one was coming down that impassable dirt road for days. They would drain whatever hot water was left in the hissing radiator into a metal canteen to keep it from freezing and to use for drinking, grab every single piece of spare canvas, greasy rags, and discarded clothing they possessed, and barricade themselves inside the coffin box. They would furiously stuff every tiny crack and splintered gap in the wood with mud, leaves, or torn rags to desperately seal out the deadly, piercing wind. In these horrific situations, drivers would sometimes be trapped inside their tiny wooden boxes for 3 or 4 days straight, surviving on completely frozen rations and melting handfuls of snow in their mouths for hydration, waiting agonizingly for the storm to break so they could begin the grueling multi-mile hike to the nearest isolated farmhouse or distant railroad telegraph station. The wooden box wasn't just a place to catch a few hours of sleep. It was fundamentally a primitive survival capsule that routinely meant the absolute difference between living to drive another day and being found frozen solid behind the steering wheel weeks later. As we pull back and look at the broader picture of this era, something deeply fascinating and incredibly inspiring begins to emerge from the harsh brutality of the wooden coffin box, because these drivers were facing such extreme, unrelenting hardship. An unwritten, powerful code of brotherhood rapidly developed on the early desolate highways, since they did not have CB radios, cell phones, or any form of electronic communication. They had to invent their own complex visual language to keep each other alive. If a driver managed to safely navigate a treacherous, washout section of a dirt mountain pass, they wouldn't just keep driving. They would stop and intentionally arrange a specific pattern of large rocks or tie a highly visible scrap of bright cloth to a prominent tree branch right before the danger zone, signaling a silent, critical warning to the next unknown driver who might come rumbling through the darkness hours later. When two early trucks passed each other on a rare wide stretch of road, they didn't just casually wave. They would carefully flash their dim, primitive headlights or use complex hand signals to communicate critical information about corrupt local police traps, hidden road washouts, or aggressive cargo thieves lurking miles ahead. And if a driver ever saw another truck parked awkwardly on the side of a lonely trail with the hood completely raised or a man desperately huddled inside a wooden sleeper box, it was an absolute unbreakable law of the road that you stopped to help. It did not matter if you were running late. It did not matter if you were carrying competing cargo. You stopped because every single man out there operating those bone-crushing machines knew with terrifying certainty that next week, next month, or even the very next night, it could easily be them violently stranded in the freezing mud, praying for the faint glowing lights of another truck to cut through the absolute darkness. They shared scarce tools, they shared their precious heated engine bricks, and they shared a profound, unspoken respect forged in the fires of extreme mechanical adversity. So, why does any of this forgotten history actually matter today? Why should we care about men who slept in freezing wooden boxes over a century ago? Because the sheer, unyielding desperation of the 1920s trucker completely forced the hand of the modern automotive industry. Factory manufacturers eventually realized that if they wanted to sell more trucks and keep freight moving continuously across expanding distances, they couldn't keep letting their primary operators freeze to death or abandon the profession out of pure physical exhaustion. The tiny, dangerous homemade wooden coffin boxes slowly forced the development of the very first factory-integrated steel sleeper cabs in the late 1930s. Those early factory models were still incredibly small and lacked modern heating, but they were vastly safer than splintering pine boards strapped to a vibrating chassis. Decades of continuous, demanding feedback from drivers pushing the absolute limits of endurance eventually led to the development of sophisticated auxiliary power units, digital diesel bunk heaters, heavily insulated thermal curtains, and the spacious, highly engineered rolling apartments you see cruising down the interstate today. Every single piece of luxury and safety equipment in a modern semi-truck exists because 100 years ago, a terrified, freezing, utterly exhausted pioneer was forced to suffer without it. The modern trucker sitting comfortably in a climate-controlled 72-degree sleeper berth while a blizzard rages outside is directly inheriting the incredible legacy of the man who once huddled around a single glowing hot brick in a pitch-black wooden cage. Now I want to turn this directly over to you because this is where the story connects to the present. Have you ever complained about a slightly uncomfortable hotel bed or a drafty window in your modern, centrally heated home? The next time you find yourself frustrated by a minor inconvenience, I want you to picture the 1920s trucker, miles from anywhere, gripping a heavy iron tire, iron in the pitch black of a tiny wooden box, listening to the wind howl and wondering if his engine will start in the morning. Let me ask you, do you honestly think you would have possessed the sheer mental and physical fortitude to survive even one single night in a 1920s sleeper box? Be brutally honest with yourself. Drop a comment below right now and let me know how long you think you would have lasted before giving up and walking away from the truck entirely. Would you have made it a week, a single night? Or would the claustrophobia and the freezing cold have broken you immediately? I read every single comment, and I genuinely want to know if you think the modern world has made us too soft to handle the realities our ancestors faced. If this deep dive into the brutal, forgotten origins of extreme trucking completely changed your perspective, and if you respect the invisible sacrifices made to build the modern world, hit that like button immediately. It tells the algorithm to push this forgotten history out to more people who need to see it. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because in the next video we are going to explore an even darker, more intense story of mechanical survival that you absolutely will not want to miss. Until then, stay curious, respect the history of the highway, and I will see you down the road.